I processed an annulment one time, and the individual testified in his own behalf, and he mentioned that every male in his family lineage, his father, his uncles, his grandfather, every male in his family lineage had extramarital affairs.
Wow.
And he entered marriage with the idea that fidelity means I have only one affair at a time.
Wow.
Okay. Well, obviously there's an intention against fidelity.
Right.
Okay. And so that marriage was declared null. Okay.
Right. Hello and welcome to Kept in Her Heart, where we talk about all things faith-related. I'm your host, Jenny Fuchs. Today, Fr Tom Kadera joins us. He is a priest, a retired priest from the Diocese of Cheyenne, Wyoming, and he is now residing in the Archdiocese of Minneapolis-St. Paul, where he does a little bit of work despite being retired. And he is here to explain what annulments are, what they aren't, and to dispel many myths about annulments. Welcome, Fr Kadera.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, why don't you just tell us what are annulments and kind of what aren't they, and walk us through it.
Okay, I think a lot of times people think an annulment is simply a Catholic form of divorce. And it really isn't, because with divorce, you say there was a marriage, now there isn't. Mm-hmm. Well, within the Catholic Church, we go by what our Lord teaches, that marriage is permanent. Once you marry, it's a permanent situation. It creates a permanent bond that cannot be broken by any human means. And so if we believe that, then that means once I'm married, I'm with that person forever. And if we decide to separate or to divorce, we're still married. So I'm not free to marry someone else. Okay. Whereas with divorce, they would say, yes, you are free to marry someone else. That's a civil thing. So within the church, one of the ways we address that is to ask the question, was this really a valid marriage? Okay. So to be valid, and even in civil law, to be valid, you have certain things that are required, necessary. So to take an example of civil law, to get married civilly, I have to have a license. If I try to get married without a license, there's no marriage. It doesn't happen. Okay, and the state would not recognize that marriage. Well, within the Catholic Church, we do the same thing, only it's much more sophisticated and difficult. And so what an annulment does is we look at the relationship at the time that they exchanged consent and ask, was this a valid marriage as the church understands marriage to be? Yeah. So we understand marriage to be permanent. We understand there to be fidelity, unity, and that it's procreative, open to having children. So if I were to enter into a marriage and say, I don't want to have kids, and so I'll marry you, but I'm not going to have any kids, I'm not entering a valid marriage, because by definition, a marriage is open to the possibility of having children. Okay, so that would be an example of one means in which it might be annulled. I might think, yeah, divorce is not an option. Marriage is permanent. But if it doesn't work out, I can change my mind and get a divorce. Well, then I'm not accepting the fact that it's permanent.
Right.
I'm saying it's dissolvable. Right. And the church says, no, it's not. Right. So if I enter into a marriage that's, I have the condition that I can leave it anytime I want. If it gets difficult, I can get a divorce. Then it's not marriage, because I'm not intending what we intend marriage to be, permanent. Okay. Similar situation with the green card marriage, I call it. I don't really want to get married, but I want to become an immigrant in the United States. I want to get a green card. And so I'll marry you so that by doing so I can get a green card. And then once I get the green card, we're free to go our own way or whatever. Again, you're not intending marriage, you're intending the green card.
Right.
And so we would consider that to be an invalid marriage. Okay. Those are just some examples. There's a lot of others, but
yeah. Can you talk about the fidelity option as well? Like some people think, well, if my husband cheats on me or my wife cheats on me later in marriage, then that isn't a grounds for annulment, but it's not later in marriage, right?
Well, infidelity in and of itself is not grounds for marriage.
Annulment.
Right, not grounds for an annulment. We recognize that people are sinners. And I may intend fidelity, but I fall short of that, okay? That does not mean the marriage is invalid. What would make it invalid is if I get married with the idea that I'm free to have extramarital relationships. I processed an annulment one time, and the individual testified in his own behalf, and he mentioned that every male in his family lineage, his father, his uncles, his grandfather, every male in his family lineage had extramarital affairs.
Wow.
And he entered marriage with the idea that fidelity means I have only one affair at a time.
Wow.
Okay, well, obviously there's an intention against fidelity.
Right.
Okay, and so that marriage was declared null. Okay, right. And so what we do with an annulment is we basically say that the things that were necessary to create a marriage, something was missing, it is not present. And so the marriage sacrament is not valid. And because that bond, that permanent bond of marriage was never created, then you're free to marry again.
Right.
It would be the kind of an explanation of that.
Right.
Okay.
And it's called officially like a declaration of nullity?
A declaration of nullity is what it's called also. Okay. And then we also have what we call a lack of form or an absence of form.
Okay.
For a Catholic to get married, the Catholic person who is baptized Catholic must get married by a priest, a deacon, or a bishop. They'll often refer to that as you have to get married in the church, which is kind of a misnomer because you can get married outside of the church building and it still be valid.
Okay.
But you can't get married by a Lutheran minister or justice of the peace or whatever and it be valid. So it has to be a priest, deacon, or bishop, or have permission from the bishop to have somebody else do the wedding. And that's granted sometimes. So I might be marrying somebody who is not of the Catholic faith. And they want their minister to do the wedding. Sometimes we can get permission to do that. So that would be an example of how you might do that.
And in those cases, then would you have them come and get what's it called? A blessing, but it's fancier, from a priest, deacon, bishop?
No.
Okay.
No, that would be different. So what would happen would be they would go through all the marriage preparation that anybody else would go through.
Okay.
And in that process, their pastor would request permission from the bishop for them to get married outside of the Catholic Church. Okay. And if that's granted, then that's considered valid.
Okay.
Okay. Now, what people will do, sometimes they'll get married, otherwise they'll go to a JP or they get married in a Lutheran church or whatever, and then come back years later when they start having children. So you got kids, and I want my kids baptized, or it's time for First Communion, I want to get them to get First Communion. And so then they say, well, I want to get my marriage in the church. I want to get it validated.
That's what it is.
Okay, so people often refer to that as a blessing. I got to get my marriage blessed. Right. Well, you can't bless what doesn't exist.
Right.
And if the marriage is invalid, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So it's not a blessing, it's what we call a convalidation, which means with validation. Okay. But just a explanation of terms, perhaps. But you'll hear most often, and maybe priests do it too. We'll say, refer to it as a blessing. Yeah. But it's not. It's a validation.
That makes sense. Yeah. That makes sense. Okay.
And then I think also there's a lot of misconceptions about annulments. Yeah. People will say, well, if I get an annulment and my marriage is not valid, then my children are illegitimate.
Right, there's that misunderstanding.
And that's not true. It doesn't, in fact, the children at all, because you have what we would call a presumed marriage, okay? And you acted in good faith. You thought you were married, you intended to have children. So it doesn't affect the legitimacy of the children at all, okay? It also does not affect the divorce decree. So sometimes people are concerned, well, if I get an annulment and my marriage is declared null, then my spouse doesn't have to pay child support. My spouse doesn't have to do this or that. Those are separate issues. And so it does not affect the civil rulings of the civil court that says, here's the conditions of your divorce and how you have to live it.
Sure, yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So it's more in the religious sphere, and then the other is in the civil sphere.
Yes, and they're separate. And you cannot use a religious annulment as evidence in a court case. That's a violation of church law, first of all. And you even sign agreements when you apply for your annulment that this is a church issue. It's not to be used as a civil issue.
Interesting. Okay. And similar, you were saying earlier, you can get a civil divorce without having an annulment or being granted an annulment.
Right. And you have situations, for example, where perhaps you're in an abusive marriage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk
okay.
about that.
God doesn't ask us to live in an abusive marriage.
Right.
Now, he asks us to do what we can to make it a marriage that's not abusive. But short of that, and if we can't do that, and it continues to be an abusive marriage, yes, I can leave that situation and maybe need to for protection of the children and even protection of myself, okay? And I could do it one of two ways. I could file for a civil divorce, okay? Or I could just separate, and that would be okay. Where it creates problems is if you want to get married again.
Right.
Okay, then you need to go through the annulment. And if you don't, say you get a divorce and you get married again, well, now you're in that category of married outside the church because you didn't get permission to get married outside the church. So then you're not able to receive sacraments or go to communion or things of that nature.
Right.
Okay? But it's only if you attempt marriage again, get married civilly.
Right.
So just being divorced, sometimes people will say, well, I'm divorced, so I can't go to communion. No, being divorced does not cause that.
Right.
It's the getting married without an annulment that causes it.
Right. Or being in a sexual relationship outside of a valid
church or marriage. Living with somebody or something of that nature. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Okay, yeah, that makes total sense.
So to process an annulment, what you would do is go talk to your parish priest. The pastor, associate pastor, whatever, but go talk to your parish priest. And then he has the forms and things to fill out and do that. And that starts the process.
Okay.
Okay. You will need to get certain documents. We have to prove that you were married, so a marriage certificate.
Sure.
Okay, we have to prove you were divorced, so a divorce decree. And we want to know what church you were baptized in, and so we'll want a baptismal certificate.
Because they track all your sacraments at the church of baptism.
Because they track the sacraments at your church of baptism. Okay, so they'll want those documents. Okay, so then the priest will help you gather all of these. That gets sent to the diocese. Okay. And along with that, you write what we call your history. So you just write out the story of your life, basically. And the Archdiocese provides a questionnaire as a guide for doing that. And they'll start with your family history. How many siblings did you have? What was your relationship with your siblings like? What was your relationship with your parents like? What was life like in the home? And how did that take place? Then it'll go from there to dating life. What was your dating life like? How many long-term dating experiences did you have? Did you have any? How did they break up? Why? Those kinds of things. Then it goes into how did you meet your former spouse? What was that dating experience like? What did you do on a date? How often did you date? How did that relationship develop? How did you come to the point of starting to talk about marriage? How was that decision to marry made? Okay. Again, one of the things that we take a look at was whether or not there was force and fear involved. So you might get into a situation where there's a pregnancy involved, and maybe mom or dad say you have to get married because you got this child now. Or maybe even the individuals sometimes put that pressure on themselves. They say, well, I was always brought up that if you get pregnant before marriage, you got to marry the person. You know, I got to step up to the plate and take care of my girlfriend and her baby, and so we got to get married. That would be in a situation where there may be force and fear. In order to exchange consent to marry, like any contract, you have to have the freedom to do so. Again, if you look at civil law, if somebody holds a gun to my head and says you have to sign this contract, it invalidates the contract.
Right.
Okay. If my consent to marry is forced from an outside force or fear, then that invalidates the contract.
Sure.
Okay, so that would be an example. Okay, so then we take a look. So we look at the next part is, you know, your dating experience with that person, your decision to get married. How did you decide? What was marriage like? What was the wedding day like? Were there any conflicts on the wedding day? What were the conflicts, and how did they come about? What was marriage like? How did you enter into marriage? When did problems begin in the marriage? What kind of problems began? What did you do to try to resolve these? Did you seek any counseling or professional help or anything? How did you come to a point of deciding, I'm done with this, okay? I'm out of this marriage, okay? So those are the questions that we'll ask.
And all of those questions are all directed at trying for your tribunal to decide or discern.
Yes.
Was this free, total, faithful, fruitful? Was it looking at all of those factors?
Yes. And we also look at a person's capacity to enter into marriage.
Right.
Okay. So I may have a situation where an individual suffers from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as an example.
Sure.
And because of the effect that post-traumatic stress disorder has on a person, it can impact their ability to make choices and decisions.
Sure.
And so they don't make good choices sometimes. Right. And we take a look at those kinds of things. Is there a psychological reason that I shouldn't have entered this marriage? You know, did I use bad judgment in making that choice? I had a case one time where, and those were the grounds that we were looking at, was, you know, you just made a bad choice. The person called me and said, you know, she was angry and upset because we were saying this, but she married a guy who was abusive and, you know, all kinds of stuff. And so I asked her the question. I said, if you were to choose to get married to this person today, would you do so? She says, no, it's a stupid idea. I said, that's what we're saying. We're saying that you made a bad decision. Right. And that's really kind of what it is. But a lot of times people don't like that because it's against them.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the process, or that's the initial process. If an annulment is denied at the Diocese of St. Paul, then you can appeal it. You have the option to appeal it. And the appeal goes to the Archdiocese of Duluth. Okay, and so their tribunal will take a second look at it. Okay. And you have the same rights in that tribunal. You can present evidence, you can have somebody represent you, you can present witnesses, you know, all of those things. They basically just do the trial all over again. Okay. They might do it on the same grounds. They might look at the case and say, these were really tried on the wrong grounds, and we need to look at a different reason for this annulment, and they'll change them. Okay. If it's denied on appeal, then it is generally considered done and decided. Okay. At some point, you have to have a final decision.
Right.
Okay, so at that point, now the exception to that would be if there's new evidence. So if I have new evidence that I can present, or if I want to try it for a different reason, maybe it was tried because of force and fear. I said I was forced into this marriage, and you said no, I'm not. Maybe there's another reason that we can grant it, and so you can apply based on a different ground. Okay. You always have the option to appeal to Rome.
Even after the appeal to the diocese?
No, after the appeal, after the second one, once you have 2 confirming decisions, then it's done. But let's say you get it here and it's denied. And you say, well, I want Rome to decide it instead of Duluth.
Okay.
You always have that right.
Sure.
I would not recommend it.
Yeah.
It's expensive, number 1. And number 2, it takes a long time.
That would be my guess. They're very busy.
Yeah, because that'll drag it out for years.
Sure.
Every diocese has an appeal court that their cases go to.
Okay.
It's generally to your archdiocese. So like St. Cloud would go to St. Paul, or Minneapolis Archdiocese.
Sure.
Duluth would go to St. Paul, Minneapolis Archdiocese. Because St. Paul, Minneapolis is already an archdiocese,
Right.
their appeals go to another archdiocese. That's why it goes to Dubuque.
Okay. How long does it take to go through the process of an annulment? Once you submit the paperwork, like how long should you expect?
The interesting part of that question is, when do you start counting the time?
Yeah.
I've had individuals that start counting the time the first day they went in and talked to their pastor.
Sure.
And then they say, well, gee, it was 6 years later before we got it done. Well, yeah, you went in and you talked to them, and then you didn't do anything for 5 years.
Right.
So a lot of it depends on you and how quickly you do things.
Sure.
Okay. So generally speaking, once you have your package together and you send it to the archdiocese, they'll review it, and then they will send you a form called a petition and have you sign the petition. When you send that petition back, that's when we start counting the clock. So it starts at that point. Because that's when you petition a court for a decision. Then there's some things that you can do to speed up the process. Talk to your former spouse. Let them know that you're doing this. Former spouses don't like surprises.
Fair.
And so if we contact your former spouse and that's the first time they've heard about it and they respond angrily, they're not going to respond very well. And they're going to delay any kind of response because this is the first they heard about it.
Sure.
Okay. So talk to your former spouse. Okay, we will notify the former spouse of the pending case, and they are invited to participate. We give them a period of time, and I believe it's 2 weeks, to respond. Then, if they don't respond, then we contact them a second time, and we wait another 2 weeks.
Sure.
And if they don't respond the second time, then we declare them absent, and we go forward without them.
Okay.
If they do respond, then we move forward from there. Okay. So if they don't respond at all, you just got a 1 month delay on the case because we have to wait a month to find out if they're going to respond.
And they could say, I don't want to be involved.
Bingo.
And that would be faster.
And that's what I usually tell people. I says, if your former spouse does not want to participate, tell them right on the form when they get it, I don't want to do this, stick it in an envelope, and mail it back. We've heard from them.
Yep.
We know they don't want to participate. We can go forward without them. Okay. But if we don't hear from them at all, we have to wait those 30 days. Okay. All right. The second area that you can help speed it up is with witnesses. And I always tell people, talk to your witnesses before you name them as witnesses.
Oh, that's smart.
Find out if they're willing to do this. Because if I name Joe Smith as a witness and Joe Smith doesn't want to do this, okay, the Archdiocese will send Joe Smith a letter and say, here's a questionnaire. You were named as a witness. Please fill this out and send it back. Sure. And he doesn't want to. So he rips it up, throws it away. Same thing. We have to wait for a response.
Sure.
If we don't get a response from him, we contact him again. Then we have to wait for a response. And if we don't get a response, then we have to contact you as the petitioner and say, you need to name another witness because this one's not responding.
Sure.
Okay, and then we start that process all over again.
Okay.
So that is probably one of the ways that you can speed it up the most,
Sure.
is get cooperating witnesses and then encourage your witnesses to provide their testimony in as much detail as possible and as quickly as possible. And when I say much detail, to simply say, for example, one of the questions that might be or is asked is, what was life like in your family? And you might say, well, my father drank a lot. And that's all you say about it. That doesn't tell me much. Okay? How did that drinking impact family relationships? What was it like? How much did he drink? How often? How did it impact relationship with a spouse? How did it impact relationship with you and your siblings? Okay, those are the details that we like to have, and that helps us in a decision. To just simply say, well, he drank a lot, it doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't tell me how that impacted the family dynamics, which is what we're looking at.
Sure, sure.
Okay, so be as detailed in it as you can. Okay, and that's all the way through the testimony for witnesses, for yourself, for the former spouse. The more detailed, the better, generally speaking.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So after we've gathered testimony from all the witnesses, between the time that you sign your petition and we contact the witnesses, we set the grounds. So we take a look at the testimony you provide for us, and we say, here's what we think the grounds are. Here's what the grounds are. Sure. And so we set the reason for the annulment.
Sure, sure.
And then you're notified of that too. Everything the tribunal does, they notify you, we've done this. Okay. So once we gather all of the testimony, then you're notified that all the testimony is in, and you're given an opportunity to review it. Okay. And if you want to add to it, you can add to it. If you don't want to add to it, you don't have to, but you can.
Okay.
So generally speaking, you would go down to the tribunal and review it there. Okay. If that's not possible, so for example, I had a case of somebody from the Twin Cities. They had appealed to Duluth. Duluth was retrying it. The individual wanted to review their testimony. So the Duluth Archdiocese called me and said, would you supervise he wants to review the testimony. Can we send the case to you and you supervise his review? Sure. So, because you can't do it in isolation. It's got to be supervised. Because they don't want you taking notes. They don't want you taking anything out of the file. Okay. You can look at it. You can get some ideas of, okay, so-and-so said this, and I want to rebuke that by saying this. Okay, and so you can add testimony, but we just want to make sure people aren't adjusting it or taking something out or whatever. Sure. Okay, so it does have to be monitored. Sure. Okay, and generally that's done down at the Archdiocese. If you want to do it outside of the Archdiocese, at the offices, you can ask, and generally then what they'll do is they'll have you do it in your parish, and your pastor will be the one that observes it, supervises it, if he's agreeable to do it. Sure, sure. So at that point then, once it's reviewed and you've had the chance to offer any additional testimony, anything you want, then it's published. And everybody's notified that the case is finished, and then we ask for decisions. So every case will have in the Archdiocese, I'll have 3 judges and a defender of the bond. So we use a 3-judge court, that's the general norm. You can do it with one. For example, like you said, I'm from the Diocese of Cheyenne. Because we're so small, we don't have a lot of Canon lawyers. We oftentimes judge them with one judge. Okay. But the norm is 3. Sure. Okay, so the 3 judges would look at it. Well, first the defender of the bond. The defender of bond is like a defense attorney in a court case, civil court case. Their job, well, it's more like a prosecuting attorney maybe, but their job is to look at the case and defend the marriage bond. So they're to argue in favor of the marriage, that yes, this was a valid marriage, and here's why I think it's a valid marriage. Okay. If it's an obvious case, obviously invalid, and they can't really present a good argument that this might be valid marriage, then they're allowed to say so, and just say, you know, I don't have any reasonable argument in favor of this marriage. You know, you don't have to come up with artificial arguments, I guess you would say, to try to defend it, but legitimate arguments of here's why it might be. Okay. If it's tried on psychological grounds, and there's two different grounds that would require a psychological evaluation. One is I didn't use good discretion in choosing to marry. We'll ask for an evaluation or opinion of a psychiatrist on that. The other is if we say the person was incapable of living what marriage is. That oftentimes comes up maybe in an abusive marriage. And then that abusive spouse, we might say, because of their history, because of their family background, because of the history of abuse, they really were not capable of living what we understand marriage to be, a mutual giving of yourself to the other.
Sure.
Okay. To do that, we have to have a psychological evaluation to say that they were not capable of marriage.
Now, if that abusive spouse, they're probably not the one asking for the annulment, and they're maybe not willing to participate in the annulment process, then they're probably not willing to get a psychological exam, right? And so what do you do in that situation?
Oftentimes, well, in that situation, you would do probably one of two things. You either set the grounds on something else, so you don't have to do that.
Sure.
Or the psychiatrist will give us an opinion based on the testimony and the evidence that we have.
The witnesses and the spouse.
Yeah, the witness's testimony, the individual's testimony. But that's why it's important for the respondent to participate, because you get both sides. Yeah, and then also in a situation like that, the psychological expert will also usually put a disclaimer on it saying, I have not interviewed this person. My opinion is based strictly on the evidence that was presented to me.
Sure.
Not on an interview with the individual.
Right, that makes sense. Okay.
Okay.
So you go through the process. We have the lawyer arguing this is a valid marriage. It goes to the 1 or 3 person judge.
Right. So the defender of the bonds argument goes to the judges. The case goes to the judges. And then again in the archdiocese, the 3 of them get together and they look at it and they discuss it. And they come up with a decision, a vote. A majority wins. So 2 of them say, yes, this is invalid, then it's declared invalid. 2 of them say it's valid, then it's declared valid. If all 3 of them agree, then it's done.
Sure.
But you have to have at least 2 in agreement.
Okay.
And then once the decision's made, then that decision is proclaimed. So you get notified of the decision. As I said, if it's a negative, you have a right to appeal. Well, you have a right to appeal a positive. I had somebody appeal a positive decision one time. She applied for an annulment. She didn't like what I wrote for the judgment, so she appealed it.
Oh my.
Even though she got the annulment. But anyway, which just proved my case in what I argued. But okay, so yeah, you do have a right to appeal. And then, as I said earlier, once there's 2 concurring courts, then it's
done, unless you have a new grounds for
unless
appeal.
you have a new ground
or new evidence.
Yeah.
Okay. And do I need to get a canon lawyer in order to apply for an annulment?
Do you need one? No. You have a right to one.
Okay.
We have what we could refer to as advocates, that you can ask somebody to be an advocate for you. And they may or may not be a canon lawyer. I was an advocate before I was a canon lawyer.
Okay.
And the advocate basically argues on your behalf of the case. They help you with the process. They might help you with your history, writing the history, and tell you, okay, you need to expand on this a little bit, or you got too much detail here, take some of this out. So they'll kind of guide you on that, and help you with it. Whether you have one or not is up to you. I find it helpful, I guess, sometimes, but it's not necessary. Now, advocates, again, depending on who you get. Some advocates charge. I mean, it's their living.
Makes sense.
It's the way they make a living, and so they will charge a fee for it. Okay. Others do not. I do it. Maybe I shouldn't publicize this, but I do it voluntarily, and I just kind of help and assist people with it. But yeah, you don't have to have one. You can have one. It could be a lawyer. It might be somebody who's just knowledgeable and can argue in your favor or for you. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Okay. And so I suppose it varies by diocese, but let's say you've gotten all of your paperwork in promptly and your witnesses respond promptly. Are we talking years? Are we talking months?
Right now, I think we're generally able to do them in about a year. And have it finished if everybody cooperates and gets them all in on time. Okay. But don't hold me to that, because
I imagine it varies by diocese as well.
it varies by diocese, it varies by caseload, and again, like I said, it varies on how quickly people get stuff in.
Sure. And appeals take a similar length of time?
Yeah. Because it's the same process.
Right, you're just doing it again with a different diocese.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Besides the written interviews that you email people stuff, isn't there an additional interview?
Yes, the Archdiocese will oftentimes call you in for an interview, and usually that's to clarify what you've put in your testimony. So, say for example, we have the testimony, and somebody put, like I referred to earlier, well, my dad drank a lot, and they want more information on that.
Sure.
So they might do an interview and ask you to clarify and add to that. So if there's areas in your history that they think need to be expounded on and clarified, they might ask for an interview to do that.
Okay. Same with the witnesses, I imagine.
Not generally with witnesses.
Okay.
Witnesses can, I believe, now again it varies by archdiocese or diocese. I don't know if the St. Paul Archdiocese offers this or not. I know we do in Wyoming. Witnesses can call in and be interviewed over the phone for their testimony.
Okay.
And we've done that. We take testimony over the phone.
Okay.
I suspect St. Paul has a similar option, but.
Okay. Excellent. And so you said, going back to the requirements for applying for an annulment, one of them is a divorce certificate. So you do have to be civilly divorced before you can apply for the annulment?
Yes. Okay. And that's primarily for liability reasons. If the church grants an annulment of a marriage where there hasn't been a divorce, they can be sued for that.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah. So there's some liability with that. And so we will ask for, and canon law requires that the divorce be granted first. Now, in some countries, they don't have divorce.
Really?
So the only option is to go through the church for an annulment.
Interesting.
And so in those countries, in those cases, yes, you can apply for it without the divorce. Like very strong Catholic countries like the Philippines and
Yeah.
I think Italy was at one time, but I think they now have divorce. Okay. But yeah, so you do have to have the divorce first.
Okay.
And we also suggest or recommend a period of time after the divorce before you file. I generally say a year.
Really?
Just to have time to kind of work through some of the pain of going through the divorce, to get settled into a new lifestyle and whatever. It can be helpful. It gives the person a clearer mind to reflect back on what happened and what took place.
Sure.
And to tell that story with a little less bias and a little less hurt and anger even.
Okay, that makes sense. Again, our valid marriage, free, I'm freely entered into it, right? Total, I'm committed to you for a lifetime, until death do us part, free, total. Faithful, I intend to be faithful to you. Now, sometimes we fall short, but the intention is there at the beginning. And then fruitful, I'm open to children. Whether or not they happen, I'm open to them. Yeah. Okay, so those are the requirements for a valid marriage, in addition to being married by a priest, deacon, or bishop within the Catholic Church. Yep.
And you have to be a certain age, and
Fair.
we don't let 5-year-olds get married.
Good. There's a funny story about that, but that's for another time. Okay, so let's say a person gets married outside the Catholic Church. Now, maybe they're Catholic, maybe they're not. Let's say they're not Catholic. So maybe 2 Lutherans get married out, and obviously outside the church. Then later, one or both of them become Catholic. What has to happen there?
Okay, let me expand on that a little bit, because I meant to cover this and I didn't. The church recognizes a marriage of non-Catholics outside of the Catholic Church as valid. So 2 Lutherans get married in the Lutheran Church, we recognize that marriage as valid. So if they decide to divorce, they also have to get an annulment before they can get married again.
In the Catholic Church?
Yeah, because we consider that to be a valid marriage. Okay, and a bond. Same thing if 2 pagans go down to the courthouse and get married.
Okay.
It's considered a valid marriage. Okay. Also, whenever we have a marriage between 2 baptized people, it's a sacrament.
Okay.
So 2 Lutherans who are both baptized within the Lutheran Church get married, it's a sacrament. Okay. A Lutheran or even a Catholic and a non-baptized person gets married, it's not a sacrament. Now, if that non-baptized person gets baptized, then it becomes a sacrament.
Interesting. Okay, so if a Catholic marries a non-baptized person, that would not be considered a valid marriage until...
It's valid.
It's valid, but it's not a sacrament.
But it's not a sacrament.
Okay. So then if they got divorced and the Catholic got remarried, they would still need an annulment?
They still need an annulment because it's considered a valid marriage.
Okay.
However, because it's not a sacrament, there's other routes to go. If we can prove that one party was not baptized, then we can send it to Rome for what we call a Petrine privilege, and the Holy Father can dissolve the marriage.
Okay.
Okay, because it's not a sacrament. Sacramental marriage cannot be dissolved.
Okay.
A non-sacramental marriage can.
Okay, but it would have to go through the Holy Father.
Yeah. If 2 non-baptized people get married, and one of them wants to be baptized or gets baptized, and the other one says, I'm not willing to live in this marriage, so they divorce. That can be dissolved by the local bishop.
Okay.
It's what we call favor of the faith. So for the favor of the party who wants to get baptized, because baptism is important, for the sake of that party, to free them up to be baptized, the bishop, local bishop, can dissolve that.
Interesting.
Okay, so those are some exceptions with baptism.
Sure.
And where it makes a difference. But yeah, 2 baptized persons get married, it's a sacrament, it's indissoluble.
Okay.
Okay, yes, you asked about 2 Lutherans get married.
Yeah.
It's a valid marriage.
Yep.
One or both of them wants to become Catholic. Do they have to get married in the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
because they're validly married.
Okay, but it's not a sacrament.
But, well, it is because they're baptized.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
Okay, because they're baptized. But no, they would not have to remarry because we already recognize that marriage is valid.
Okay. Interesting.
Okay.
If Yeah, if they were previously married and their spouse died, that's the dissolution of that marriage because the spouse died. Yeah.
Yeah, because the death of a spouse dissolves a marriage.
Right.
Right, and then you're free to marry again.
Sure, that makes sense. Okay. So it's a little complicated.
It's a little complicated. I had a teacher in Canon Law School that said, you need to know and to do this with truck stop talk. Don't use canonical terms, whatever. Speak like the person in the truck stop talks.
Sure.
You know, the lay person. Yeah. So to make it a little simpler, a little easier to understand. And so I hope I was able to do that.
Yeah, no, I think you were. Thank you for doing that and for explaining it. And if they have questions, the best place to go?
Start with our parish priest.
Okay.
Okay, and if the parish priest can't answer it, they can probably get the answer by calling the tribunal and get the answer.
Okay.
When I was in a seminary, our teacher of canon law was very strong on, if you have a question, call the tribunal, call the tribunal, call the tribunal. One of the questions on our final exam was, what's the phone number of the tribunal?
There you go. Make sure you're utilizing it. All right, well, appreciate the time. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found that interesting and informative. If you have questions on an annulment or what it is or isn't or how to get one, like he said, talk to your local parish priest or contact the tribunal in your diocese. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment and share this with others so that they can be informed. Thanks for watching.